Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Behavioral Science Summit. I'm so excited to introduce products and services, productive businesses, and efficient teams. Here to discuss the topic, Land of 20,000 Mother Tongues. Please, let's welcome our speakers. It's good to have you here. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much for inviting us. To all the people who have joined in from different corners of the world, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. And we will take you on a small journey with us and bear with us for a moment while we get the screen share ready. All right. Please let me know if you can see this in full screen.
Yes, we can see it.
I'm assuming thank you so much. All right. The topic that we're talking about is land of 12,000, land of 20,000 languages.
12,000 are, I mean, it's actually much more than that, but the reason that we say 20,000 and sometimes we say 12,000 is because some of them are dialects, not necessarily languages with complete scripts. But yeah, we can say 12, we can say 20, you can add a couple hundred more.
So we try to understand how a rich context informs behavioral design in different cultures and different societies. So we quickly take a look at decision-making theories because we are all students of behavioral science. There are different theories: the heuristic systematic model, there is the ELM, the elaboration likelihood model, somewhat similar. One popular one is attribution theory, and then we have a couple of dual process theories. The most popular of these theories, in DPT, is system one and system two thinking. And behavioral science is, it's not system one science, it is not system two science, it is behavioral science. But when you look at behavioral science right now in pop culture, it pretty much is a part of pop culture. What happens is, for most of us, right, the charm, the allure, the glamour of behavioral science comes primarily from system one thinking, from the magic of system one thinking, from the realization that you can make a small change here or there, which in turn can influence someone's decision, someone's behavior. Which makes sense because everybody loves magic and this seems magical. However, like we said, behavioral science is not system one science, it is system one and system two science, is behavioral science. So we take a step back and say, what is it that makes behavioral science complete? What makes behavioral science what it is? What makes behavioral science, what impacts or influences behavioral science? And if you take a step back, you realize we're talking about context. And when you talk about context, yes, go on, please.
Very simply put, essentially, when we look at human behavior, we try to influence human behavior. You are architecting a context because of which this person is going to behave a certain way. Behavior in itself is nothing but a reaction to a context. So if one of the things that we do at 1001 is we look at context very strongly and we try and understand what are the different components of this context that are influencing this behavior. What is making this human to react in the way that he is? There are a bunch of different things obviously that affect, and context is literally everything, right? This is something of, this is a very very basic framework of something that we work with, where we look at what is the ask of the era, what is the ask of the time. Time defines times, trends. They define so many different things for us, and we behave according to the expectation of the time. There is linguistics, which is what we want to cover today. Social norms. There are trigger points. There are things that trigger us from hot states and cold states, and these are completely context dependent. And then there is collective memory. There are many nuances in this. This is not an exhaustive list, obviously, but we wanted to pick on just one or two pieces of context, just to look at how, when you pay attention to even one small part of context, how much more information, how much richer our interventions can become.
The approach that we have to behavioral science and the work that we do and what you're going to talk about, it is, of course, influenced by our own experiences in the field and our work that we have done. At the same time, it is also influenced pretty much by research done across time and period by different folks who are trying to understand how exactly language, how exactly societies, culture, and values influence or change behavior. Is it possible that our memories act differently? Is it possible that we interpret things differently depending on which culture we belong to? It is influenced by work from different domains. And when we talk about linguistics, which is what we want to focus on right now, it makes sense to start with Ludwig Wittgenstein.
One of the most brilliant philosophers, language philosophers, and one of the most beautiful things that Wittgenstein would talk about is the fact that your vocabulary literally is the limit of how much you're able to understand the world. The limits of my language or the limits of my mind, all I know is what I have words for. Even semiotics, the science, it defines language as sound image. What it means is, if I'm thinking of, if I say, think of a chair, what I'm doing is that I'm imagining the picture of a chair and I'm literally swapping that with you. So now you have images of chairs in your mind, different chairs. We're never sharing the same image. I can never fully convey to you what I'm really thinking. I don't know if you're thinking of the same chair I'm thinking. I don't know if it's the same color. I don't know if it's the same height. When I say, I had dinner on my dining table, I don't know what dinner you imagined. I don't know what dining table you imagined. I don't know what you thought I was eating. I have just managed to share with you a concept, and those images actually are what have created reality for the both of us.
And what better place to talk about language than the country where folks speak almost 20,000 languages, India. And all right, we have a lot of languages. I think almost 22 of them have been recognized by the constitution of the nation, right? And these languages, they have different roots, yet at the same time, certain common cultural concept, ideas, they are equally a part of all these different languages, all the different cultures which speak this language. And one of the most important one which you want to touch right now is
Maryada. So this is to take you through what we mean, we thought, let's give you an example of something that is happening in the context of the country right now. And it's interesting. The word Maryada is a word that comes from ancient Sanskrit, and Sanskrit is the language that is the root for most of the other, literally the root of most of the 20,000 languages that come, or sub-roots per se. Maryada means a bunch of different things according to the language that you're speaking it in. In languages like, in the southern languages like Kannada, Telugu, Malayalam, there are many languages. In many of those languages, Maryada means dignity. It talks about virtue. It talks about a sense of duty. But as you go towards the north, and as you explore context, as you can talk about Maryada in many different ways, and it spreads. It can talk about values. It can mean shame. One of the ways that people talk about Maryada is they say things like, do you have no shame, is also a way to use Maryada. And they also say things like, oh, he is so full of Maryada, which is that this person is very dutiful. They mean very different things. The contexts are very different. Do understand this?
Yeah, the reason we picked up Maryada as the word out here is because for a country like India, which has 8,000 or at least 4,000, 5,000 year old history, right? You want to find out a word which is weighty, which carries on that weight throughout the ages. And
It becomes more than just a word, and yeah.
yes, and which is still relevant today. And Maryada is that word. And how so? Reshma explains it right now. Let the story out here.
Yeah, it's the story of Maryada in itself. It's literally the context setting for the word Maryada. And let's start with the first place that you really hear it. It's one of the Indian epics called the Ramayana, where you hear about the hero of the story, who is Rama, who is worshipped as a god also in many parts of the country, amongst Hindus, and he is called Maryada Purushottama Rama, which essentially means the best of righteous men. If we were to take you through the legend of Rama very quickly, it's a very large epic, but if we were to condense it, essentially it begins with Lord Rama, the prince. He's the prince of a kingdom called Ayodhya, and he's the first of four brothers. Supposed to be the best, the best of them all. He's always been the best at school. He's incredibly obedient. He's dutiful. His parents love him, and there is a turn of events because of a promise that his father has made to one of his three wives, that he was going to let her give her a boon, whatever she wanted. And the opportune moment when Ram is supposed to become the king of Ayodhya, the second queen, in something of a fit of jealousy, because she wants her son to become the king instead of Rama, so she asks for this boon, and without blinking an eye, Ram says, my father is asking something of me, and my father has made a promise to my second mother, so I'm not going to fight this. I will happily go into exile, and I will leave the throne, I will leave the kingdom, and I'm going to go away. So Ram takes his wife Sita, and one of his brothers, who loves him a lot, refuses to leave him, and so he follows him. So it's Ram, Lakshman, and Sita, and they leave on a 14-year exile.
Right. So it's a story of this prince who could have had everything, but chose to give it up because he felt that was the right thing to do. That was his Maryada, or that was his duty. Why is this important?
He follows. It's not just his duty as a son that he's keeping. It's his duty. He also upholds his father's Maryada by doing this. As the story continues, it's essentially what happens is that in the forest, Sita gets kidnapped by his wife. Sita gets kidnapped by a demon called Ravan because she is incredibly beautiful, and he decides that he must have her. He kidnaps her, takes her away, and then Ram and Lakshman, along with an army of monkeys, and who become one of the biggest devotees, and they love Ram a lot. They march all the way to Sri Lanka, to Lanka, where Ram is, and they build a bridge atop the Indian Ocean, and they go to Lanka. They fight Ravan, they beat him, and finally it's also the end of those 14 years, and then Ram rescues Sita again, and he brings her back to Ayodhya.
However, during this journey, there are many times when Ram keeps on making sacrifices. And the reason he keeps on making those sacrifices and goes through hardship is because that is his Maryada, that is his right, that is his duty, that is what he's supposed to do.
One of the things that also happens, it's interesting, before we move from Rama, because the focus of the story here is throughout on Rama, and Rama, being the dutiful son, leaves the kingdom because it is his duty, it is his Maryada, and he's also upholding his family's name by not breaking that promise that his father has given to his second mother. When Sita is kidnapped, when she's abducted, he travels all the way to Lanka to bring her back, and he's doing that because it is all one. Obviously, it's because he loves his wife, but he's driven by the Maryada of a husband, and it is something that a husband must do. He must protect his wife, and he must bring her back. It is also something that he must do for the name of his family. It is something that must be done in the name of righteousness, and these are the things that drive him to do what he's doing. But there's another place that throughout the story, Maryada is used throughout when it comes to in context of Ram. But there is one more place that Maryada comes in the middle, and it's a slightly different context, and it is in the context of Sita herself and the way that she gets abducted. The way that Sita gets abducted is that when Ram is away, getting her a golden deer that they're in the forest, and there is this beautiful golden deer that is prancing around, and it's actually not. It's a demon in disguise, and its sole purpose is to lure Ram away so that Sita can be abducted by Ravan. And she begs Ram to get the deer. She thinks it's a beautiful animal and she wants to take it back. She wants it as a pet. So she sends Ram to get the deer, and Ram leaves. And then when Ram shoots an arrow at the deer to get it, the deer suddenly changes its voice, and in Ram's voice starts calling for help, because of which Sita and Lakshman, who are back at the cottage in the middle of the forest, get very nervous, and they say something's wrong with Ram. And Sita begs Lakshman to please go and help Ram. And Lakshman, because he has to leave, he draws a line around if you can see this line in the painting, he draws a line around the cottage, and he tells Sita, this is a Maryada, you must not cross it. This is how you're going to be protected, and I'm going to make sure that nothing happens to you.
Long story short, the bad man, the villain, he tricks her
Ravan
and gets her to cross that line, which is how she gets kidnapped in the first place.
And here it is said that Sita, she crosses the line. Here Maryada takes on a completely different context altogether. So if you look at the word Maryada itself, and you look at the concept of Maryada, not just the word but the concept, because even when we say that a word when we say that something is a definition, what does definition really mean? A definition means a line, a periphery, a boundary around something, and that something is a concept. What is Maryada really as a concept, and what does the spectrum mean? It begins with virtue and duty, and then it comes to culture. It also means then a societal expectation from an individual. Mm-hmm. From that societal expectation, it begins to also mean what is your individual responsibility. And then if you have to meet that individual responsibility, it's about conformity and finding societal validation in those boundaries. That is the whole spectrum of what Maryada really stands for, which is why, as Prakash, it's a very weighty subject. Why are we talking about this? It helps us understand the culture a little more, because essentially what it means is that we live in one part of the culture. I can't say that the entire culture is like that, but one important nuance of the culture is that India is a society of elders. It's a culture that cares well for its elderly population. In fact, I think we're the only country,
as far as I'm aware of, yes,
that where the Supreme Court has warranted that the abandonment of elderly parents is punishable by the law. And it is the responsibility of the children to look after their parents and to make sure that they were looked after. It's very common for it's not intrusive in the culture for someone. If there is a couple that seems to be moving abroad, it is common to ask them, but what about your parents? What are they going to do? Because it's an expectation that you will look after your parents.
And if you look at the stories that we share across time and culture, across time, these themes keep on repeating, right from the time of Rama to Shravan, who takes his fathers on a long pilgrimage, right, to Yayati's son, who gives up his youth to his father. Constant theme throughout the Indian culture, the Indian society, the Indian ethos, even till today, as you can see in this particular judgment.
It is a collective culture. And what this essentially means is that if you, as an individual, if you have to come outside this collective culture and explore an individualistic culture, it means that it has to be done in private. It has to be done in a place where it is somewhere where the elders are not going to be able to see what you're doing. It has to be done privately behind society's back.
If following Maryada means living a life of restraint, and if Maryada is what you should aspire to, it follows from there that a life of freedom, a life where you are free to pursue whatever you want, is an irresponsible, not desirable, not good for society kind of life. And yes, society understands that this is still going to exist, which is why the approach that, and I'm choosing the word carefully out here, it is almost behavioral sciences. What you see is all that there is. So when it comes to my visual sight, I want to see Maryada being followed. And as long as I'm not aware of what you are doing beyond my sight, I guess it's fine.
Which is why a lot of Indian, I mean, again, we are saying that this is a nuance, it's not the complete culture, of course. There is no one such thing. But relationships have to be done privately. They have to be hidden. You don't date openly. You don't watch. You don't let anyone know that other than your friends. No one knows if you're watching risque content, if you have porn, if you have a relationship, if you are into, if you have a relationship, and if you have sexual relationships, if you're these things are not supposed to be spoken about. But while this is the case, society and even parents, the elders understand that individualism is part of course it's an important part of it. So the way that it works is it literally works with look the other way. Make sure I don't know, because if I know, I'm going to have to give you my permission, or I'm going to tell you that you can't do this. So just make sure that I don't know. As long as I don't know, do what you want behind my back. That's somewhat what the way that you deal with Maryada is, which is something that brings us to a very random segue to Netflix.
Fantastic app, fantastic product, fantastic application of System 1 thinking. You can skip the intro. You have insane amount of content available to you. You can also skip the end credits, sequence, just to make sure that you can save the 2 minutes and you don't have to exercise your thumb muscles. Netflix also goes and says, you know what, I'm going to make it all autoplay for you, right? So they've thought about a lot of things. But what is it that they did not think of?
I think globally, it works fantastically. I mean, even across the world, everyone appreciates that these are fantastic interventions, and they help content quite a bit, consumption of content quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Very System 1 influenced way of thinking.
But what essentially has happened is that in the country right now, which is very relevant right now, to Netflix seems to have crossed the proverbial Lakshman Rekha, which is the line that was crossed around, which was drawn around Maryada. And there is a lot of conversation about how Netflix has trampled over the Maryada of the country. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that there is some culture, that is some content that is very risque, and it is promoting a lot of sexual content. It's spoiling the youth, and there's a lot of this conversation that's happening. Obviously, there are some takers, some don't really care, but it's come up to the point where these OTT platforms have come up for scrutiny and for censorship, which is causing a big debate in the country.
What happened here was, while a good amount of attention was being paid, by the way, we are not for or against any of this. We're simply speaking, right? Just in case you're confused, right? But you need to understand what's happening out here. A good amount of attention was paid to System 1, not so much to System 2. And what this means is, in a country which operates with Maryada being what is desirable, if you right there in the world of popular searches tell me exactly what is happening out there, if you show me stuff which is giving into desires, which has the exact opposite of restraint,
and mind you, this is not searched for. This is what turns up
right when you go to a search button, right? What this means is, maybe Prakash wants to search for it and then he gets to see it, in which case I get what I want. But maybe Reshma or someone else or my parents don't want to search for it, and yet because of the way we design the app, it is one of the first things that they're going to see. Which brings us to,
essentially what is happening is that Netflix is designed to to give you the freedom of choice. Find whatever you desire, whatever be your mood. But this existing in the context of where Maryada prevails, which is that individualistic overindulgence is a strict no. The behavioral design has worked very well, but culturally it seems to have backfired.
What are the learnings for us from this? We will touch them in a moment. While designing solutions, and this is one of those really obvious things, almost behavioral science 101 we are talking about. Context matters, cultures matter. The language that the people speak matters. Their mythologies matter. Their histories matter. Their mental models matter a lot. One simple solution out here and would have been or can be, you don't have to do with your entire catalog of risky material. All you want to do is remove it from the immediate visual realm of Prakash, Reshma, and the parents to a place where we are recreating the thrill of finding risky material. What this does is it gives society the way to deal with this definition of Maryada, which means be restrained, have your control. And if you're doing something which I am not aware of, which I can't see, I guess that's fine. But I guess that's fine is something which I'll not say. I'll just leave it at that.
Essentially, as soon as you open the app, the first thing that you see is this material. We're not talking about the search bar, but as soon as you get in, the first thing that you see is popular, and you see that this is what is there. What it cues is that Netflix is telling me to watch this because it's popular. But say it were just moved 2 or 3, I have to scroll just a little. I have to come just two times. I have to come down to see it. It means I found it. I was looking for it and I found it. The onus is now on me. So then I can leave it alone because then it becomes a matter of choice. Otherwise, it's something that Netflix is showing me.
Okay. Once again, I'm not talking about, Reshma is not talking about censorship. That is not the intent of our discussion. The intent of our discussion is simply saying when you're designing your product, when you're designing your service or solution, be it physical, be it digital, right? It helps to understand the cultural context in which it is going to be used. Which brings us to, hi, how are you? Which brings us to obviously how you're doing. This simple question of asking someone how you're doing, right? Depending on which part of the country you are from. If you ask in Assam, your answer is Beya Nahoy, which means not bad. If you ask this in Punjab, the answer is Sab Changa Si in Punjabi, which means everything is fantastic. If I go and ask someone in Maharashtra, how are you doing? How are you doing? He or she is very likely to connect it to the market and say, you know, the usual, how it is for everyone. Market is doing good or market is bad. He or she kind of delineates himself from the individual, connects it back to how the market itself is operating. Again, these are mental models. And if you go down to the state of Kerala, what you observed is if you ask someone how they're doing, even if they're doing extremely well, there is almost this need to discount it and say, well, I'm not really doing that well. Please do not be.
It's kind of the way that they will put it. There is a slightly pessimistic tone and there is a slightly, things have been better. You remember back in the day, things were better. No one says, they won't tell you automatically that everything is fantastic and it's going well. They'll tell you about how bad things are as compared to another time when things were better.
So there are two things what happens here, right? Number one is the interpretation of data. When you're trying to do behavioral science, you're trying to find solutions. The first step obviously is collecting data and being able to interpret it correctly, right? We already know there's a difference between my good and the good used by Reshma. We can use good to mean two different things. Add to that the complexity of having different languages which have different mental models of interpreting and responding back to people, right?
This is something that our own research has showed us, where when you ask people to speak about, you can try it out sometime. It's an interesting thing. If you are bilingual, most of the country is bilingual. Many people speak 3 or more languages as well. It is so diverse that, for instance, Prakash and I work together and we speak to each other in the same language that we're speaking to you in, because I don't speak his native tongue, he doesn't speak mine. It's quite diverse, and because of it, the cultural memories, the mythologies, they all change according to it, which also changes your mental models. Our own research has showed us that if you try to, say, narrate a story in your life or talk about an incident in your childhood in 2 or 3 different languages, where you shift the language in the middle of the story, the interpretation of the story begins to change, and it completely changes dependent on the context and the phrases that are being used.
The fact that language affects memory and perception of reality is getting documented by now. But let us prove it to you right through a small travel from India to Japan. And the culture, the language used in Japan now, they places a very high premium on compliance, on what people think of you, on face, keeping and honor. There was research being done when they found out one of the reasons, the most important reason why people are wearing masks out there in Japan, and mask is something they even wear. I mean, they were wearing before the pandemic too, is peer pressure, because someone is expecting you to wear your mask, right?
Saving face is a very important is a very important idea, that where you cannot have somebody in society point a finger at you and believe that you are acting against community. Their sense of this is also most Eastern societies are collective societies instead of being individualistic societies. But in Japan, the sense of community is incredibly strong. The sense of responsibility towards that community is incredibly strong. So social norms automatically become very strong.
From there, if you straight up go down to the US, you will see a different response towards being asked to wear masks. But what is interesting is this protesting or not being willing to wear a mask is not something new which is happening right now during COVID times. This is something which happened even almost 100 years back during what is now called the Spanish flu pandemic. Is it because there was no information about it and people did not know then, and hence they were protesting wearing a mask? The answer is no, because even then there was enough effort being done to get people to understand wearing a mask helps, saves lives. People are putting up policies, people are putting up fines, and yet they would refuse to wear their mask, and they would have protest the way they're having it today. The question is why, and does the language being used
tell us something about the culture in itself? Is it again, if I were to bring that comparison, the eastern cultures in the West, as you come towards the West, the cultures start becoming more individualistic.
Mm-hmm.
And which means that if you have to do something for the sake of an entire community, it means losing something for yourself to be able to give to someone else, which is a loss.
There has been research done which helps explain how different societies, different cultures, they've reacted to the pandemic and its restriction in a different way. Loose nations versus tight nations, in the sense of, are the societies more individualistic or more collective? Which brings us back to India, and it brings us back to the question saying, if there are so many different languages in this country, and the response to a simple question of hi, how are you doing, can be so different, how do you get people to take up, one cause, or how do you implement a common public policy? How do you get people to do things? Is public shaming going to work, because India is a collective society? So we, if you look at it, and this was a very quick dirty survey which we ran for the purpose of this particular presentation itself, with around 300 people. And when you ask out people saying, why should people wear masks? What is very interesting is almost 62% people say because it is the right thing, because it is the duty, it is the maryada of people to wear masks. These concepts, right, that we talk about, what weighs heavily, whether it is freedom in terms of the American, saving face in terms of the East Asians, or Maryada in terms of the Indians. They keep on influencing the way we do things, the way we interpret our world, sometimes without us being explicitly aware of it. And as we reach the end of this presentation, I do want to leave this thought out there saying, all right, can we then harness the power of linguistics to bring about change? And, I'm not sure if many of you were able to, identify what's happening out in this particular picture. Some of you probably are. I'm not sure how many of you were able to identify what's happening in this particular picture. Some of you might. Let's go back to Ludwig Wittgenstein, and what he said was, the limits of my language are the limits of my mind, and all I know is what I have words for, which means we can only identify that which we have a name for. The moment I said this is what is manspreading, for all of us who did not know this till now, it becomes easy to now, here onwards, look and say, all right, this particular gentleman is manspreading.
And to identify it no matter where we see it.
The moment I put up a word saying this is mansplaining, it becomes easy for us who are not aware of it till now, but who had seen it, who recognized it, but would not articulate it because the tool for doing that was missing, right? Mansplaining. It becomes quite easy for us, not quite easy, all right, let me take it back because nothing is very easy. It is quite possible for us to harness the power of linguistics to bring about behavioral change, to bring about or build a new context. Okay, let me rephrase. It is possible to harness the power of linguistics to build a new context, which in turn can cue and bring behavior change. And I am not sure how much of time we have for a Q&A. I think we're almost at the end of our time. But if we can take some questions, if that's possible, that's okay with us.
Thank you for taking your time to speak to us about such an unconventional and interesting topic. We have around 10 minutes for Q&A session. I really encourage everyone to use raise hand button or Q&A. There is one question in the chat about research which was in one of the slides related to language influence to economic decision. Maybe you can mention it now.
The particular study?
Yes, I think it's about the name of the study.
Yes, I think it's Jen's research.
Yes. Give me a moment here, please. The effect of language on economic behavior is by M. Keith Chen, 2013. If you Google search for this, you should be able to get it.
The in a very if I were to put it briefly, if I were to explain it in the quickest way that I can, it's a phenomenal research. He's done there are some brilliant videos also that are available on it if you want to take a look. He essentially talks about how there are languages that have a concept of a future, and there are future speaking languages and languages that don't have the future, that don't think in the future. So languages that think for the future, that it's not about just I will save, because it's about the way that the language is constructed, the way that the sentence is constructed. They say I save for the future itself. Apparently even Mandarin has this way of talking. Because of these concepts, because of the language and the way that it is spoken, apparently the saving increases, because there is an understanding of, there is a greater relationship with the future self. And they're able to save, and this is how it's affected some economical decisions for these families. That's essentially what this research is about. It's a very, very interesting paper.
Thank you. We already have the other question. How is the policymaking process in India influenced by the multiplicity of languages used?
All right. Okay, fine. Let me. Let me attempt that question because you're not making my life easy by asking the question. I would have loved it if it was in the realm of corporate projects and all. The thing about India is, and I'm assuming you might be looking at it from a behavioral science perspective. So let me address that first. Number one, at this point of time, we do not have a strong. I mean, in the UK, we have a BIT, and even the Obama administration right now, the Biden administration is heavy on using behavioral science while putting up public policy decisions, even formulating them. Right, we do not have that as yet, in our country, but we do have the change slowly coming down, which means. And anything with government takes time. There's a small evolution to that, right? There's a lot of status quo. You want to do things in a particular way. So the first answer is that saying it is an evolution. We are still in the process of bringing in the behavioral science nuances to deciding, understanding, formulating, and then implementing policies. Number two is, I do not want to say this is going to explain the entire thing, but what I'll put down to you is, in a country like India, there is one huge challenge in the sense formulating policy can be done at the central level by the government, by the legislative policy, right? Execution of that happens through the executive, which are your IAS, the Indian Administrative Civil Service people, right? But then the actual ground level implementation happens through folks who are on the ground in different districts, and each district has its own nuances. I'll give you a small example would be the yearly uproar about burning what do you call is crops,
waste
crops around November, December in the areas around Delhi, and that contributes a lot to smog, and it makes breathing and all difficult, right? While you can institute a policy around Green India or not doing it, XYZ, all of that is central level. By the time you're trying to implement that, you've come down to a person whose incentives, whose cultural context, whose mental maps might be quite different. And so the implementation changes. At times, that means the implementation is not as effective as we would want it to be. I hope that helps a little bit.
If I were to give
answer.
an example from the case that we were talking about, which is in all these different places, the way that they even react to how are you when it is different, it gives you something of an idea of what is the attitude towards society, right? There is a certain amount of, if I'm not going to be able to tell you how well I'm doing and I'd rather mask it in how bad things are, that means I have very less faith in the person asking me the question. I don't trust society so much because they might be wanting to take something from me that I would rather safeguard for my family and for my community and for my people. If you know that this is the way that they function, then it means that the way that you approach policy building and the way that you approach, say, public goods will differ. In a place like Delhi, where there is an openness to say that everything is okay, and mind you, this is not coming from a place of trust. It's coming from a place of posing. It's coming from a place. This is a society that has evolved over many centuries to be incredibly aggressive because of the number of wars that were fought in this place. And what it's done to the people is to say that I'm not going to hide my money from you, to keep it right in front of you, and let me see you try and take a penny from me. And so I'm going to pose in front of you. But this also means that there's the same person, if you go to them and say, hey, you know what, we're building a park in the neighborhood, and it would be great if if you donate to this, we'll put a large plaque with your name on it, and that's a great incentive for this person to come ahead and donate. Whereas for someone who wants to hide the money, it would be a great idea to tell them, because it's coming from a place of what good does it do to me, and how am I going to. It's not that they're not averse to helping the community. There's just a fear that there is going to be taken more from them. So if public goods came to them from the perspective that if we build a park in this area, it will bring the rate of real estate up for you, and that means that your shops will earn more rent, or your property is going to be, is going to fetch greater returns, then it might be a greater incentive to invest in it. So I think that is one of the ways that this can be used. I hope that answers. your question as well.
Thank you for the answer. We have some more questions. The one is, what are the recent work that 1001 Stories has done in improving social impact?
Social impact itself? All right. Okay. This called Soch, Society for Children. And what Soch does is, it rescues runaway kids who run away from their home. And these are primarily from a certain socioeconomic background, not very well to do. And the challenge with runaway kids is, within a week or 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, you can still find it a way to easily reintegrate them or find them back with their families, connect them back. But once the gap increases, the possibility of harm to the child in terms of abuse, physical, sexual, in terms of mental, in terms of addiction increases, which kind of makes reintegration difficult. So they have lovely programs and they work out of state of Orissa, Bhubaneswar. And one of the challenges that they've had is with fundraising. How do you go about raising funds? Because these programs require money and, staff, all of that, and 20,000 different things. Which brings us to a very interesting question. How do you get people to donate? And
what is the motivation?
Why do people donate in the first place?
Why do people donate in the first place? Exactly.
Right.
If I could just bring a nuance here, an interesting thing about we're talking global donations, of course, but if you look at just India and a couple of other societies, it's not just India. It's an interesting thing because it's not that we're not a charitable lot. The average Indian at some point in time in their life, in some cases multiple times, has donated money, large sums of money, not really to a charity but to a temple, or to a mosque or to a church. It is some sort of religious shrine that they've done this for. What they earn in return, they know that the temple is going to use it for some sort of charitable purpose. So they're going to use it for food or for clothing or for education or for hospital, so whatever. But that is the place that they put their trust in rather than go to charity, to an NGO and donate that money. So we've also been trying to understand, how do you bring that kind of trust to a place that works with children, and what's the science of fundraising? So we've done that. We've done some amount of work. We do work with sustainability. We've been trying to figure how to help the waste problem per se in our own cities. And we're hoping that there will be more of that.
I hope next time, if you ask me this question next year, I have a lot more answers. Like I told you, we've been very much focused on making money. Right now, there's been a lot of corporate projects, but we have of late started working on sustainability, waste reduction, giving back to society in our ways. Yeah. And the solution we advocate and work with are both a mix of the usual, let's say, in case of donation, the identifiable victim effect, social proof, but also, like we talked about, the cultural nuances of the society in which we want to implement this change.
Those examples that you mentioned are really impressive. There is another question. Can you give an example where you have specifically used context architecture and linguistics while working with your clients, and how it made an impact in business policy?
There is this one case which is very dear to us because it was a fantastic realization.
Are you talking about Humble Bean? Because I want to talk about Humble Bean in that case.
I was talking about Counting Well.
All right. With Counting Well, I'm not sure how much we can talk with the solution, but I think with Humble Bean we can definitely talk a lot more. But yes, please go ahead with Counting Well. Let's risk it.
Okay. So let me give an example of something that we had done, and obviously without revealing too much, because there is some stuff that belongs to the client itself, and I mean as solutions. This is Counting Well is an app that works on teaching math to children, And this is a country that is very focused on grades, right? It's about getting good grades, and this is math, like it's supposed to be a thing. And an interesting thing was when we spoke to lots of parents. We spoke to lots of parents across the country, and we also spoke to their children. An interesting thing that came up was that a lot of parents said that, oh, when my kid is not good at math, I send them to a private tutor, and the private tutor teaches them well and they understand it. So the tutor is excellent, and so I don't necessarily need an app, or I don't, even if I get the app, I don't need to go beyond the demo. It's just something that my kid can play with, but my tutor is going to be the one who looks after everything. So we tried to understand where was this coming from, and where was the idea that the tutor was doing very well coming from. And so when we spoke to them, we paid attention to what they were saying, how they were talking. So, and one of the things that kept coming up, I'm going to talk about this particular case, something that kept coming up with a lot of parents is they said that the tutor was doing a good job. The tutor is capable, is efficient, and they're very happy. The child is doing well. This is a whole cloud of that is packed together. It's one concept, it's one idea that my child is doing very well, and the tutor is responsible for it. And there are a bunch of different words that come into that word cloud. So we try to explore those words a little more, and we try to explore that concept itself a little more. And we said, how do you know that what was not good? What was happening when the child was not working well? What was happening? And essentially what this did is triggered that the studying for the child usually happens literally in the center of the room, and the parent, the mother, is someone who keeps walking around the child constantly to see what the child is studying. She doesn't actively participate in the teaching, but what essentially happens is that she says, oh, you've stopped now, you're not studying. What happened?
To give a small context to this, was just before this discussion, we were debating, should we put up a new feature in the app that involves the parent a lot? In the sense, should we get them to teach? Should they get them to take tests? Should we get them more involved? Because an involved parent is going to be happy with a product, saying, I like this product, it's making me bond with my child. Because the first thing, if you ask a parent, do you want to put the time and attention towards teaching a kid? The answer is yes, of course. I as a father, I as a mother, obviously want to do this. And then what we found was
that when the child, when we asked the parent what happens, they said, so the child is studying and I'm walking around saying, oh, why have you stopped? You're not focused, and things like that. The child at some point turns around, looks at the parent and says, I haven't figured this out. Can you teach me? The moment the parent is faced with this question, the parent just freezes, because this parent hates math far more than the child does, and does not want to be involved in teaching this child at all. This is something that I am willing to do everything on this planet, but actually sit down and teach you. That is what we basically figured. And that was one of the things that informed us.
But the contextual reality as a parent, it is difficult for us to voice this reality and say, I actually don't want to teach my kid. I would rather this struggle, this pain is outsourced, is taken away. I don't want to see, if the visual of my kid struggling in front of me, if the auditory sensation of the child asking me a tough question goes away from near me, I am going to equate, what I do is I equate that absence of the pain
absolutely
to actually a success, which is why it was interesting to realize that even though a lot of parents send out their kids to private tuitions to study, additionally, that even there is no,
there is incremental change. When they believe that the child is very good, how are they measuring this? They believe that the tutor is very good. How are they measuring this? It is not because of the marks, because if the child scored, say, a 50 or a 60 before the tuitions, they scored a 60 or a 62 or a 63 post the tuitions, which means that there is no real change in the score. But what has happened is that the visual of the child sitting on the table and struggling and asking the parent, that has disappeared. And that is what the parent is equating to is very good, has worked very well. It is nothing to do with the child's problems being solved. It's to do with the parents' problems being solved.
So in terms of the app, then this means making decision on what kind of features you want to implement. Do you want to get the parents involved? How often? What is that line where the parent says, I like this? And when they set the screen too much?
And how do you use these insights to actually put features in the app so that the parent feels involved in the child's learning without actually actively having to be part of teaching?
Thank you.
Was half split, possibly during the presentation. Please blame it on the camera. Take care and stay safe.